Alright, we're looking at problem 718 from Brigham and Houston, Fundamentals of Financial Management, Concise, 9th edition. Here we have Kempton Enterprises has outstanding bonds, $1,000 par value, 10 years to maturity, 11% annual coupon, and they currently sell for $11.85. The bonds can be called in 5 years at 109% of par value. Alright, so asked to calculate what's the yield to maturity and what's the yield to call if they're called in 5 years. Alright, well, we'll start with that. Number of periods, rate, PV, FV, PMT. Alright, this thing's making itself smaller for some reason. Alright, so the yield to maturity is fairly simple. They have $1,000 par value, 10 years left, 11% annual coupon. So the par value is $1,000, 11% coupon means they pay $110 a year. They have 10 years left to go, and we're given that the current price of these bonds is $11.85. So negative 185 is the price, and from there I can calculate a yield to maturity. That's the 10 years, $110 a year, currently sell for $11.85. At the end of the 10 years you get your $1,000, and there's our yield to maturity. Okay, so yield to maturity. What's the yield to call if they're called in 5 years? Okay, so this is yield to maturity, and this is yield to call if they're called in 5 years. Let's center all this to make it pretty. Okay, so if we call it in 5 years, the price of the bond is still $11.85, and it's still paying $110 every year. However, if they call them in 5 years, it'll be at 109%, so that'll be $1,090. And if we calculate the yield to call, that would be 7.91%. Alright, so what we see here is that 5 years from now the bonds could be called, and the yield to call is lower than the yield to maturity, so the assumption is that they would actually call the bond. Well, the author's part D starts getting convoluted, but they actually want you to go through there and calculate what the yield to call would be for each of the years. Okay, so they can call the bonds at year 5 at 109%. They could call in year 6 at 108. In year 7, they can call at 107, and so forth. Okay, so the call premium declines each year. So if we assume that instead of calling the bonds at 5 years, they call them 6 years from now at year 4, that would mean that an investor would have been able to hold the bond for 6 years and then only get 1,070. Oops. In year 6 is 108%, so that'd be 1,080. All right, so that's still a lower number than the yield to maturity. If we assume they call them in year 7, it'd be yield to call with 3 years to go. That would mean that you would hold the bond 7 years and then sell it back at 1,070, and that's still lower. Okay, So if the corporation called it in either year 5, 6, year 5, year 6, year 7, from now, they're still going to be saving money. If they wait till 8 years from now, when it only has 2 years left, and they only got 1,060, then that actually be good for the investors. So if they're going to call it, they're going to call it either in 5, 6, or 7. Now the assumption built into the pricing is yield to call. Corporations call the bond first chance they get where they can save some money. Okay, so we could have lived for a long time without doing problem D, but that's their convoluted question that they're trying to get to. Generally speaking, the only thing we really pay attention to as investors is the yield to call, assuming the first chance they get. All right, when you start getting into complicated stuff, meaning you're not in a leveling course, but you're in some advanced financial analysis, the rest of this crap might come up. But in this class, yield to call computed the first chance they get and compare that to the yield to maturity. There's no sense for the corporation to not call it at the end of 5 years from now because it'll just cost them more money to delay.